She came in silence, rain dripping from her coat, eyes hollow with secrets too heavy to carry alone. When she handed the sheriff a rusty key, he didn't know it would unlock decades of buried sins, tear apart a town's fragile peace, and shatter his own family's legacy. The evening was quiet in the small town, where the streets emptied early and the only sound was the hum of crickets rising into the summer air. The sheriff's house stood at the end of a long gravel driveway, a structure both modest and imposing, in its way, with a wide porch that seemed to command the land it overlooked. Life for the sheriff had always been marked by duty, silence, and an unwavering routine. Each day flowed into the next with little disruption, as if the weight of the badge had become less about action and more about watchful patience. But that night, the rhythm of his life was interrupted when a knock echoed across the heavy oak door. It was not the hurried knock of a neighbor seeking help, nor the timid tap of a visitor uncertain about disturbing him. It was steady, deliberate, almost ceremonial, as though the act itself carried meaning. When he opened the door, he found a woman standing under the pale glow of the porch light. She appeared tired, her clothes dusty, her posture carrying the burden of someone who had traveled a long distance with secrets too heavy to speak aloud. She did not greet him with words, nor did she seem nervous under his questioning stare. Instead, she extended her hand, and within her palm rested an object so inconspicuous and yet so strangely unsettling, a small, rusty key. The metal was corroded, flecks of orange and brown marking its surface, but the shape of the key was clear and deliberate. She placed it into his hand, as though transferring more than an object, as though surrendering a piece of history that had been waiting for the right recipient. The sheriff turned the key in his fingers, its rough edges scraping against his skin, and for the first time in years he felt something stir in him beyond his duty. The key seemed wrong in his hand, as though it carried a story too old and too dark to belong in the present. He looked back at the woman, whose eyes reflected a mixture of exhaustion and grim purpose. She said nothing, but the silence between them carried weight, as though the explanation was not meant to come from her lips but from the key itself. With a final nod she turned away, leaving him standing at the door with a piece of rusted metal that already began to feel like a curse. The sheriff carried the key into his home, placing it on the heavy wooden table near the window where moonlight spilled across its surface. He studied it, trying to imagine what lock it once belonged to, what door it had opened, or what secrets it had once imprisoned. Something about it unsettled him in ways he could not name, a feeling that went beyond logic and into instinct. He thought about discarding it, leaving it outside or dropping it into the creek behind his house, but something in him resisted. The woman had chosen him specifically, had walked to his home with clear intention, and he could not shake the thought that ignoring the object would only invite greater unease. That night sleep did not come easily. He drifted between shallow dreams and restless awakenings, each time with the image of the rusty key pressing against his mind. In one dream, he saw an old wooden door at the edge of a forgotten forest, the key hanging in the lock as though waiting for him to turn it. In another, he heard whispers behind the door, indistinct voices that grew louder the closer he came, but every time he reached out, he awoke with a start, sweat beading on his forehead. By the time dawn broke, he understood that the key was not something he could dismiss. It demanded to be acknowledged, to be solved, and he could already sense that his life was about to change because of it. The next day, the sheriff went about his duties with the same measured calm he had always carried, but his mind was elsewhere. The key sat in his pocket, heavy despite its size, an ever-present reminder of the unanswered questions it represented. He visited the townsfolk, checked on disputes, ensured peace where it was needed, but all the while he thought about the woman and why she had chosen him. He could not remember seeing her before, yet she had known where to find him, had known enough to trust him with whatever the key meant. The unease that had taken root in him grew stronger, and he found himself glancing toward the key more often than he wanted to admit. By evening, he began to notice subtle changes around him. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones, mentioning strange occurrences near the edge of town. Unfamiliar figures seen at night, lights flickering where no power lines ran, whispers of old legends resurfacing in casual conversations. None of it seemed directly connected to the key, But his instincts told him otherwise. The woman's silence, the deliberate way she handed him the object, the unease that followed, everything pointed toward a truth that was circling him, waiting for him to step closer. The sheriff was not a man prone to superstition, but years of service had taught him to trust patterns, to listen when his gut told him something was wrong. That night, he placed the key under the lamp, staring at it until the room grew dark around him. The rusted metal seemed to absorb the light, its jagged edges casting shadows larger than they should have been. He reached for it, gripping it tightly, and felt a sudden chill run through him, as though the object itself carried a memory too cold to touch. He realized then that this was not just an old piece of metal. It was a message, perhaps even a warning, and he had no choice but to uncover the truth behind it. As he sat in silence, the weight of the key pressing into his palm, the sheriff knew the next step was inevitable. He had to find out where it belonged, what door it had once opened, and what secrets it was still keeping locked away. The woman had given him no instructions, no words, but she had given him purpose, and in the stillness of his home he felt the beginning of a path unfolding before him. The sheriff leaned back, staring out at the night sky, knowing the quiet life he had lived was over. The rusty key was not just an object, it was the start of something larger, something that would pull him into shadows he had long kept at bay. And as the clock struck midnight, he realized he was ready to follow it wherever it led. The sheriff sat in the quiet of his dimly lit kitchen long after the woman had gone, the rusty key still resting on the oak table where she had placed it. He had not touched it again, not since it had slipped from her fingers into his home, carrying with it the weight of decades of silence, of secrets buried under time and dust. He had stared at it for hours, tracing its every jagged tooth and rust-bitten edge with his eyes, trying to piece together why it felt so unsettlingly familiar. By the time the first light of dawn bled through the curtains, he knew that sleep would not come, not until he confronted the meaning behind it. Memories began to surface like fragments of a broken mirror, reflecting pieces of a life he had locked away within himself. The sound of iron against stone, the smell of damp earth, the echo of his father's stern voice telling him never to wander near the old mill on the far side of town. It had been a warning he had obeyed without question as a boy, but now in the stillness of his kitchen, he wondered whether that warning had been more of a command to stay away from something deliberately hidden. By mid-morning, he wrapped the key in an old handkerchief and tucked it into his pocket. The town was beginning to stir, the ordinary rhythm of small-town life spilling into the streets, shopkeepers unlocking doors, children chasing one another, the sound of hammers on a roof being repaired. Yet for the sheriff, all of it blurred into background noise as he made his way toward the archives of the county courthouse. If there were answers to be found, they would lie in the brittle pages of property ledgers and records long forgotten by everyone else. Inside, the musty air of the courthouse records room pressed down on him. Boxes lined with dust, drawers filled with yellowing documents, the scent of time itself clinging to every corner. He pulled file after file, his fingers skimming names. He knew well, families that had shaped the town, properties passed from generation to generation, and then buried deep in the records of the 1930s, he found it. An entry marking the construction of an underground holding site near the old mill, described vaguely as a temporary storage facility, its ownership attributed not to the county, but to a private trust with no listed heirs. The lock specifications detailed in the file matched the unusual cut of the rusty key. The sheriff felt the air in the room grow heavy as he absorbed the revelation. A secret facility, one that no one alive seemed to remember, tied to the very landscape his father had warned him to avoid. Why had the woman brought him the key, and why now, after all these years? He thought of her tired eyes, her trembling hands, the way her voice faltered as if she were carrying a burden that had grown unbearable. It was not just a key she had given him, he realized. It was responsibility, perhaps even a final chance to confront something festering beneath the town's surface. That evening, as shadows stretched long across the land, the sheriff drove out toward the outskirts where the remains of the mill stood in silence. The building had long since collapsed, reduced to broken beams and ivy-covered stone, yet the air around it felt thick with memory. He parked his truck on the dirt road and walked the last stretch on foot, the crunch of gravel under his boots, echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness. The rusted skeleton of the mill loomed ahead, a monument to industry long gone, but his eyes were drawn to the earth around it, to the faint outline of a stone hatch half hidden beneath overgrowth. His pulse quickened. The courthouse file had not lied. The underground site was real. With trembling hands, he unwrapped the key and crouched by the hatch. The lock was ancient, its iron eaten by rust but still intact, waiting as if it had been expecting him all along. He slid the key into the slot, and for a moment he hesitated. The weight of generations pressed on him, as if turning that key would not only open a door, but unravel truths that could never be locked away again. Slowly, he twisted. The mechanism groaned, resisted, and then with a sickening click it gave way. The hatch creaked open, releasing a breath of air so stale and damp it carried with it the scent of forgotten years. Inside, a narrow staircase spiraled into darkness, each step descending into silence deeper than the last. He fetched a flashlight from his truck and began the descent, the beam cutting through the black to reveal stone walls slick with moisture. The further he went, the colder it grew, until he reached the bottom where a narrow corridor stretched ahead, lined with heavy iron doors. On each door was a number carved deep into the metal, their surfaces mottled with rust. He stepped closer to the first door and noticed something etched faintly beneath the number, worn with time but still legible. A name. It was a family name he recognized, one tied to a line of people who had vanished from town records without explanation. The sheriff's breath caught in his throat. He checked the next door and the next, and with each discovery his horror grew. Names of families long gone, names no one in town spoke of anymore, all marked on doors leading to sealed rooms. The woman's trembling voice came back to him, her desperate eyes, and suddenly he understood. The key had not been just an heirloom, it was the opening to a buried truth, one tied to disappearances, to bloodlines erased, to secrets his town had never acknowledged. As he stood there, flashlight trembling in his hand, he knew this was only the beginning. Whatever the purpose of this place had been, it was tied directly to the town's history, and now he was the one standing at its threshold. The key had opened the first door, but the truth would demand he open many more. And as he turned toward the corridor's end, where a larger door stood heavy and foreboding, he felt the unmistakable weight of destiny pressing down on him. The woman had passed the burden on to him, and there would be no turning back. The sheriff sat behind his desk late into the night, the rusty key lying in the center of the blotter, like some cursed relic pulled from the ruins of a forgotten town. He could not bring himself to touch it again, yet he could not look away from it either. The metal, dulled by years of neglect, seemed to hold a weight disproportionate to its size, as though every secret of the Hollow Creek Valley had been compressed into that single jagged piece of iron. The old woman's warning echoed in his ears, and though he told himself he was a man of law grounded in reason and fact, some part of him quivered at the memory of her words and the haunted way her eyes lingered when she left him. Unable to sleep, he lit a lamp and retrieved the old property. Maps that had been stored away in the courthouse archives. He spread them across the table, running his finger over the faded ink and the cracked parchment. At the edge of the township, near the swampy lowlands that most avoided, there was a parcel of land marked only by a black square and a notation so faded it could barely be read. After squinting for several minutes, he made out the words Lockwood Estate, a name he did not recall ever hearing. He searched through the more recent deeds and property transfers, but that lot was absent, erased from all subsequent registries, as if it had been swallowed by time itself. And yet, on the oldest maps it remained marked, waiting, hidden behind decades of silence. The next day the sheriff took the key in his pocket and rode out to the edge of the swamp. The air grew heavier as he approached, the road narrowing into a crooked path flanked by twisted pines and thick brush that seemed to lean in closer the further he went. Birds no longer sang, and the hum of insects replaced the morning chorus. At last he came upon a rusted iron gate, its bars bent and nearly overtaken by ivy. A great lock, corroded but intact, clung to the chain that held it shut. His breath caught when he pulled the key from his pocket. the teeth fitting perfectly into the lock's ancient mouth. The sound of the mechanism turning was deafening in the still air, and the gate swung open with a long groan, as though protesting its own awakening. Beyond lay a dirt path, partially hidden beneath roots and moss, winding into the thicket. He followed it, each step feeling heavier, his boots sinking into damp earth. At last, through the branches, the outline of a house emerged. Tall, narrow, its windows shattered, its roof sagging, yet somehow it still held itself upright as though sheer will prevented its collapse. The Lockwood estate, abandoned but not forgotten, loomed before him. Inside, the air smelled of mold and ash. Furniture lay broken, a piano slumped in the corner with strings exposed like ribs. Strange carvings were etched into the doorframes, circles, lines and symbols whose meaning was lost, but whose intent felt heavy. Dust shifted with each step he took, as if the house exhaled at his intrusion. And then he saw it. In the main hall, beneath the decayed chandelier, a trunk rested against the far wall. It was large, iron-bound, and bore a keyhole that matched the very key now trembling in his hand. He hesitated. Something deep inside whispered against unlocking it, warning that what had been sealed should remain so. But he was sheriff, a man, tasked with uncovering truths no matter how painful, and the weight of his duty pressed harder than fear. He slid the key in and turned. The lock clicked, and the trunk creaked open. Inside were documents, ledgers, letters, and deeds, each stamped with seals of the old families who once ruled Hollow Creek. But more disturbing were the photographs, sepia-toned images of gatherings on the estate grounds. In one, a group of men stood in a circle, torches raised, their faces hidden beneath cloth masks. In another, townsfolk gathered in fear as the same men brandished weapons, forcing them to kneel. There were lists of names, families known to him, some still living in the town today. It became clear that the Lockwood estate had been the headquarters of a secretive order, a brotherhood that had imposed its will on the town generations ago, vanishing only after a fire had gutted part of the property. As he sifted deeper, he found something more chilling, a small leather-bound book, its pages filled with detailed accounts of judgments carried out against those who defied the order. The handwriting was precise, clinical, but the acts described were anything but. Punishments ranged from exile to outright executions, all masked beneath the claim of preserving order. And at the end of the book, written in a hurried scrawl, was a final entry. The key must remain with the chosen, lest the door be opened again. The sheriff snapped the book shut, his pulse hammering. He understood then that the old woman had not been warning him of danger in some vague, superstitious way. She had been passing the responsibility of this secret into his hands. The Brotherhood may have fallen into silence, but if their records were to be exposed, the town's most prominent families would be implicated in atrocities. Everything, their businesses, their power, their influence, rested upon no one knowing what had taken place at Lockwood. As the sheriff left the estate, carrying the trunk's contents with him, a cold wind cut through the trees, and for the briefest moment, he thought he heard laughter carried on the breeze. It wasn't the joyful laughter of children, but the low, triumphant sound of men who had long ago believed themselves untouchable. Back in town, he locked the documents in his office safe, but word travels fast in a place like Hollow Creek. By nightfall, whispers began circulating that the sheriff had been seen at the old estate, that he had taken something from it, that the past was no longer buried. Old families with deep roots in the town began to stir, and beneath their polite smiles he sensed a growing unease. The sheriff knew then that he had awoken something that would not rest quietly. The rusty key still weighed heavy in his pocket, though its purpose was fulfilled. It was no longer a key to a lock, but a key to truths long buried. And though he had unearthed them, the greater question remained. What to do now that the silence of generations had been broken? The sheriff leaned back in his chair, staring at the safe, the unease gnawing deeper with every passing hour. He had thought finding the truth would bring clarity, but it only brought more shadows. And as the clock struck midnight, a knock echoed at the door once again. This time, it was not the old woman. The next morning, the sheriff awoke with the weight of unfinished business pressing down on him like a storm cloud. The rusty key remained on his desk, a silent reminder that something was waiting for him, something important enough for a frightened woman to risk knocking on his door in the dead of night. As sunlight filtered weakly through the blinds, he knew that pretending it was just an ordinary key was no longer an option. The town deserved answers, and more importantly, so did the woman who had placed her trust in him. He decided he would start by revisiting the old Miller property, the house that had always been spoken of in whispers, the one people claimed hadn't been truly lived in for decades. Something told him that the key belonged there, that its rust and weight carried the history of that land. The house sat on the farthest edge of town, alone on a patch of overgrown weeds that once served as farmland. The sheriff parked his cruiser at the entrance of the crumbling driveway and stood silently for a moment, surveying the forgotten place. Its windows were boarded in some spots, cracked in others, and the wooden siding was warped with rot and weather. The structure seemed to lean on itself, as though exhausted from years of abandonment. Locals had always said it was cursed, that screams had once echoed from its halls, but no one could ever agree on the truth of those stories. All the sheriff knew was that when he held the rusty key in his hand that morning, his gut told him this house was its match. He approached the front door, feeling the creak of the boards beneath his boots. The brass lock had dulled with time, and yet when he slid the key into its teeth, it turned with a strange smoothness, as if it had been waiting. The sound of the mechanism unlocking was sharp and final, like the turning of a page that could never be unturned. The sheriff stepped inside, flashlight in hand, and the smell of dust and decay struck him immediately. The air was heavy, unmoving as if trapped for years, and cobwebs hung in thick strands across the entryway. The house groaned with his weight, protesting his intrusion, but he pressed forward. Every corner seemed to whisper, every shadow seemed to watch. Room by room he searched, and though the house was empty of furniture and life, he began to notice peculiar details. In the living room, a patch of the floorboards had been replaced far more recently than the rest of the house. In the kitchen, faint stains lingered on the tile, too dark to be dirt, but too old to be clear. Upstairs, he found a single room whose walls were covered in scratch marks, desperate etchings that reached almost to the ceiling. It looked less like a bedroom and more like a cell, a place where someone had clawed to escape. The sheriff's jaw tightened, and his heart pounded harder with every discovery. At last, in the basement, the true secret revealed itself. The stairs creaked dangerously as he descended into the dark, his flashlight cutting through the thick shadows. The basement walls were stone, damp with moisture, and the floor was dirt except for one square patch of concrete that looked deliberate. On that patch sat a locked chest, old but intact, its iron latch unmistakably matched to the rusty key he carried. His pulse quickened as he knelt and slid the key inside. The lock clicked open, and with it came a rush of cold air, as though the chest itself had been sealed with more than just metal. Inside, he found stacks of weathered documents tied with string, photographs that had yellowed with age, and a leather-bound journal whose cover was cracked from time. As he flipped through the contents, a chilling picture began to form. The papers detailed land transfers and hidden agreements stretching back decades, showing that the property and much of the surrounding town had been bound up in secret ownerships, false sales, and debts that were never repaid. The photographs revealed faces of families long gone, but some of those faces were familiar, tied to names that still held power in the community today. And the journal? The journal was the darkest piece of all. Its entries spoke of punishments, of people taken to the house and never returning, of debts settled in silence. They told of screams in the night, of men and women locked in rooms until their families complied with demands. The writing grew more frantic as the pages went on, as though the author had descended into madness. The sheriff realized with horror that the old stories were not myths. This house had been a place of cruelty, of control, and its legacy had quietly lived on in the very HOA and council that ran the town now. His hands trembled slightly as he closed the chest, because now he understood why the woman had come to him with the key. This was not just about one old house. This was about generations of corruption and cruelty, about people who had built their power on the suffering of others. The sheriff knew that if this truth became public, it would shatter the foundations of the community. And yet, to keep it buried would make him no better than those who had committed the sins in the first place. As he locked the chest again and carried it up the stairs, he noticed something he had missed before. The front door, the one he had closed behind him, was now standing slightly ajar. His instincts sharpened instantly, and he reached for his sidearm. Someone had been there. Someone had followed him. The sheriff scanned the empty yard, but no figure appeared. Still, the uneasy certainty remained. Whoever had left the key on his doorstep knew exactly what it opened, and they weren't the only one. Driving back to his office, he couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on him, waiting, watching, calculating his next move. He placed the chest in his evidence room and locked it tight, but even then he knew the danger was just beginning. The weight of the town's darkest secret now sat squarely on his shoulders, and those who had spent years protecting it would not let it go without a fight. As the sheriff sat alone in his office that evening, the key resting once again on his desk, the air outside grew heavy with the sense of an approaching storm. He had uncovered the truth, but now came the hardest part, deciding whether to expose it and bracing for what would come when he did. The time for hiding was over. The past had clawed its way back into the present, and the sheriff was the only one standing in its way. The storm broke at last, not in rain or thunder, but in the quiet reckoning of dawn. Sheriff Daniels had not slept through the night. The rusty key had become both a curse and a compass, dragging him back into the shadows of his own past and the buried sins of the town he had sworn to protect. That final night, he had spread the old documents across his desk, brittle pages, faded ink, names of men long dead but not forgotten. Each letter, each record, was a fragment of a truth the town had chosen to bury, and now the weight of all that silence bore down on him like chains. By sunrise, he understood what he had to do. The truth could not remain hidden, even if it destroyed the fragile peace everyone clung to. The townsfolk gathered that morning in the square, summoned not by formal notice but by whispers, phone calls, and the unmistakable tension that had been building all week. Faces worn by suspicion and curiosity stared toward the courthouse steps where the sheriff stood, the rusty key hanging from a chain around his neck like some talisman of judgment. The woman who had delivered it stood nearby, her eyes hollow but resolute, as if she too understood that the day of reckoning had arrived. Daniel spoke not as an officer of the law, but as a man burdened by knowledge, his voice carrying across the crowd with steady gravity. He told them of the hidden cellar beneath the oldest barn on the outskirts of town, its locked door sealed by the very key he had been given. He told them of the bones found within, the ledgers documenting money taken and lives destroyed, and the undeniable proof that men once trusted as pillars of the community had conspired in crimes too cruel to ignore. A murmur rippled through the crowd, disbelief warring with recognition, as if part of them had always known but never dared to confront it. Some turned away in shame, others clenched their fists in fury. The sheriff continued, his words sparing no detail. He named the families who had profited, the officials who had looked the other way, the generations that had lived comfortably, atop foundations of silence and blood. By the time he finished, the square was filled not with noise, but with the heavy silence of truth finally spoken aloud. The rusty key, once just an odd relic, had become a symbol of all that had been hidden, and all that must now be faced. But truth is never free, and Daniels knew that by revealing it he had condemned himself as much as anyone else, for buried among those records had been his own grandfather's name, listed as one of the men who had collected hush money and enforced the cruel order of those years. Though Daniels had lived his life in service of justice, the blood of complicity ran in his veins, and he saw in the eyes of some townsfolk that they held him accountable as well. Still, he did not flinch. He had chosen this path, and he would bear whatever came of it. For the first time, the town looked at him not only as their sheriff, but as a man willing to sacrifice everything for the truth. The aftermath unfolded quickly. The courthouse archives were unsealed, investigations launched, and long-suppressed stories came pouring out like floodwaters from a broken dam. Families who had once held power found themselves questioned, and those who had lived in quiet suffering finally spoke without fear. The woman with the hollow eyes disappeared from town soon after, her purpose fulfilled, leaving behind only the key now stored in the sheriff's office as evidence. Daniels carried out his duties with a quiet resilience, though he knew his days of easy trust and authority were gone. He had shattered the illusion, and the town would never look at him, or itself, the same way again. Weeks later, he walked through the square at dusk, the place where he had torn the veil of silence. Children played without understanding the weight of what had changed, while elders sat with gazes heavy and uncertain. Some still avoided him, others nodded in solemn respect, but all knew that the turning point had come, because one man had chosen to speak when he could have remained silent. In that there was a strange kind of peace, even amidst the wreckage. The rusty key still hung in his office, no longer a burden but a reminder. It reminded him of the cost of secrets, of the courage it took to confront them, and of the legacy he hoped to leave. Not one of silence and complicity, but of truth, however painful it might be. And though he carried the scars of what he had revealed, both on his conscience and in the town's divided gaze, he knew deep down that he had done what was right. As the sun sank below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of fire and gold, Sheriff Daniels understood that this chapter of his life, like the story of the key, had come to its end. He did not know what awaited him in the years ahead, whether redemption, rejection, or simple obscurity, but he had faced the truth, and for the first time in a long while, he felt free. The story had begun with a knock on his door and the hand of a trembling woman offering him a rusty key. It ended with a town forever changed, a sheriff forever altered, and the knowledge that sometimes the smallest object, passed quietly from one hand to another, could unlock not just a door, but the soul of an entire community. And in that final, quiet as the night settled once more over the town, the sheriff whispered a promise to himself. Never again would silence rule where truth demanded to be heard.